I woke up from a medically induced coma, only to hear my own flesh and blood signing my death warrant. "Do not resuscitate him," my son told the doctor, in a voice completely devoid of emotion. "Keep him comfortable until the end." I lay there trapped in my own body, pretending to be unconscious, while my children casually planned to dismantle the empire I had spent 40 years building. Before I tell you how I systematically destroyed their lives and took back everything they tried to steal, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever realized that the people you trusted most were the ones holding the knife. My name is John Mercer. I am 63 years old, and I learned the hard way that giving your children everything is the fastest way to turn them into monsters. I grew up with dirt under my fingernails in a cramped, drafty house in Ohio. I built my commercial real estate development company from a single rusted bulldozer I bought at a municipal auction when I was 22. My late wife Diane and I worked 18-hour days. We poured concrete, negotiated with ruthless contractors, and slowly acquired property block by block until our name was on the side of half the commercial plazas in the city. We built a fortune through sweat blisters and an unbreakable bond. When Diane passed away a decade ago from a sudden illness, a massive piece of my heart went into the ground with her. To cope with the grief, I poured all my remaining love and resources into our 2 children, Justin and Danielle. I paid off their Ivy League tuitions in full. I bought them luxury homes in gated communities. I handed them executive titles at my firm that they had not earned. I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was protecting them from the brutal financial struggles Diane and I had endured in our youth. Instead, I had unknowingly raised a pair of entitled vultures who were simply circling the sky waiting for me to drop. The reality of my monumental failure came to me on a sterile, unforgiving hospital bed. A massive heart attack had dropped me to the floor of my home office 3 days prior. The emergency doctors had placed me in a medically induced coma to let my body stabilize and to protect my brain from swelling. When I finally began to drift back to consciousness, the very first thing I noticed was the rhythmic, agonizing beep of my heart monitor. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead, completely glued shut by exhaustion and medication. A thick, dry taste coated my tongue, and a heavy tube scratched at the back of my throat. I was just about to force my eyes open to groan for a nurse to bring me water when I heard voices at the foot of my bed. It was the unmistakable voice of my 34-year-old son, Justin. He was speaking to a man who sounded like the attending cardiac physician. The doctor was explaining that my vitals were finally stabilizing, but that I had suffered significant trauma to the left ventricle. He laid out the options for aggressive surgical intervention, bypass procedures, and a long but highly viable road to recovery. I laid there in the dark, waiting for my son to ask about the survival rates, to demand the best surgeons in the state to fight for his father's life, just as I had fought for his. Instead, Justin cut the doctor off mid-sentence. His voice was perfectly steady, entirely devoid of the panic or grief you would expect from a son losing his father. He said, "Doctor, my father has always been an incredibly proud and independent man. He would never want to live his life hooked up to machines or face a debilitating, pathetic recovery. We need to be realistic about his quality of life." My daughter Danielle chimed in immediately. Her voice had that practiced fake sympathy she always used when she wanted to manipulate a situation. She told the doctor that it broke their hearts to make this choice, but that Justin was absolutely right. "We want to transition him to palliative comfort care," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sorrow. "And we need to establish a strict do not resuscitate order immediately. If his heart stops again, do not try to revive him. Let him go peacefully." The words hit me harder than the massive cardiac event that had put me in this bed. Do not revive him. Comfort care. They were explicitly instructing the hospital staff to let me die. I lay perfectly still, my mind screaming in absolute outrage, but my body locked in place by pure, cold shock. The doctor hesitated, noting his professional opinion that I still had a strong chance of a meaningful recovery. But Justin pushed back with the arrogant authority of a man who held a legal medical proxy. The doctor finally let out a defeated sigh and relented, promising to bring in the official paperwork for them to sign. The heavy wooden door of the hospital room clicked shut. The room fell dead silent save for the rhythmic beep of my monitor. I focused entirely on keeping my breathing slow and even fighting the massive surge of adrenaline that threatened to trigger the machine alarms and give away my consciousness. I heard the rustle of a designer coat. Danielle stepped closer to my bed. The scent of her expensive perfume, a brand bought exclusively with the generous allowance I provided her, filled my nostrils. She let out a heavy sigh, but it was not a sigh of grief. It was a sigh of profound impatience. She asked Justin how long palliative care usually takes to finish the job. Justin walked over to the window, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking sharply on the linoleum floor. He told her it did not matter how long my body held out, just as long as the doctor officially declared me legally incapacitated by the end of the week. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, completely unaware that his comatose father was absorbing every single venomous syllable. Justin told his sister that the corporate buyers from the Chicago investment firm were getting impatient. They wanted the 4th Street commercial plaza. My heart sank deeper into my chest. The 4th Street plaza was the crown jewel of my portfolio, the specific property Diane and I had spent 10 agonizing years developing from a vacant lot into a thriving commercial hub. It was my legacy to their mother. Justin explained that the exact moment the hospital issued the incapacity declaration, the forged power of attorney document he had secretly drafted would legally activate. They could completely bypass the estate lawyers, bypass the trusts I had set up, and execute the sale of the plaza for $30 million before I even took my last breath. Danielle let out a soft, greedy laugh that made my stomach churn. She told her brother to make absolutely sure the lawyers had the transfer deeds ready to sign by Friday. She casually mentioned that her husband Chris was breathing down her neck about a massive margin call on his investment fund, and they needed the liquid cash immediately to cover his failing bets. I lay there in the sterile dark of my closed eyes, the horrifying truth washing over me like freezing water. My near-fatal heart attack was not a family tragedy to them. To my own children, my failing health was nothing more than a perfectly timed business opportunity. They had been waiting in the shadows for a moment of physical weakness, and my heart had just handed them the keys to the kingdom. My initial instinct was to open my eyes, tear the tubes from my throat, and scream for the nurses to throw them out. But the pragmatic, calculating businessman inside me took over. If I opened my eyes right then and demanded help, Justin and Danielle would simply act like concerned children. They would claim I was delirious, confused from the heavy trauma medications. They would use my outburst as definitive proof of my mental decline, lock me in a legal conservatorship using their forged documents, and finish the job while I was trapped in the system. I realized in that agonizing moment that my survival depended entirely on my absolute silence. I had to remain a dying corpse in their eyes. I had to let them think they had won, while I secretly planned to burn their entire lives to the ground from the inside out. The machine beside me kept beeping, no longer just tracking my pulse but serving as a steady drumbeat to the war that had just begun. The heavy wooden door clicked shut again, taking the doctor and his medical ethics out into the hallway. I kept my breathing shallow, fighting the burning ache in my chest. A few minutes later, the sharp, rhythmic clatter of stiletto heels echoed against the linoleum. It was a sound I recognized instantly. Megan, Justin's wife. She did not bother to whisper or tiptoe. She walked into the intensive care unit like she was inspecting a slightly disappointing hotel room. The first thing she did was complain about the smell. She loudly told my son that the scent of antiseptic and sickness was ruining her appetite, and asked how much longer they had to stand around a dying man. I felt a surge of pure disgust. I had paid for her lavish wedding. I had bought the designer clothes she was currently wearing. And here she was treating my deathbed like a mild inconvenience in her afternoon schedule. Justin told her to keep her voice down, but Megan just scoffed. She casually announced that she had already taken care of the heavy lifting. While I was bleeding out on my office floor 3 days ago, she had not immediately called the paramedics. She had gone straight for the wall safe behind my mahogany desk. She bragged to Danielle and Justin that she had completely stripped the safe of my master ledgers, the physical property deeds, and the offshore account routing numbers. She had bagged up 40 years of my financial history while my heart was struggling to beat. She even laughed about how easy it was to find the physical override key I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book on my shelf. She had stood over my dying body and looted my life's work before dialing emergency services. Danielle asked if she had left any fingerprints on the safe dial. Megan laughed a sharp grating sound that made my blood run cold. She told my daughter that the police do not dust for prints when an old man has a heart attack in his own home. But then Megan shifted the conversation to the immediate problem. She told Justin that keeping me in a strict state hospital was entirely too risky. The attending physicians here were too thorough. They asked too many questions, ran too many tests, and were clearly hesitant to just let me slip away on a morphine drip without a fight. Megan had a solution already perfectly mapped out. She proudly revealed that she had secured a private transport for the following morning. They were moving me to an off-the-grid palliative care facility on the edge of the county. She called it a boutique hospice, but the way she described it sounded like a dark site for the inconvenient wealthy. She told Justin that the facility was owned by a subsidiary shell corporation completely disconnected from standard medical oversight boards. The doctors there did not ask questions. They were paid exceptionally well to look the other way, keep the pain medication flowing heavily, and sign death certificates without requesting autopsies or notifying the state medical board. They were going to traffic me out of the hospital at dawn and quietly euthanize me in the shadows, where no one would ever investigate the timeline of my passing. The heels clicked away, followed by the soft thud of the door closing, as my treacherous family finally left to grab an expensive dinner on my dime. I was left alone in the dim, sterile glow of the monitoring equipment. I waited for hours. I waited until the chaotic hum of the hospital ward shifted into the quiet, desolate stillness of the graveyard shift. The clock on the wall blurred in my vision, but I could tell it was well past midnight. I forced my brain to command my broken body. The pain was absolute agony. My chest felt like it had been crushed under a concrete block, but the cold, calculated fury burning in my veins pushed the physical agony aside. I slowly, painstakingly opened my eyes. The harsh fluorescent lights stung, but I forced my vision to focus. I looked at the array of wires taped to my chest. As a commercial developer who spent decades dealing with complex electrical systems and bypasses, fooling a standard hospital monitor without triggering a code blue alarm was just a matter of identifying the primary ground wire. I peeled the adhesive patches off my skin with agonizing slowness, looping the sensors together to maintain a steady artificial baseline reading on the screen. I was disconnected and the machines still hummed their steady rhythm. I swung my heavy, numb legs over the side of the bed. My knees immediately buckled, but I caught myself on the cold metal railing. I peered through the glass partition of my room. A night orderly was slumped in a chair down the hall, snoring softly, with his chin resting on his chest. A cheap prepaid burner phone sat dangerously close to the edge of his medical cart. I dragged my battered body across the room using the wall for support. I slipped the phone from the cart with trembling fingers and retreated to the dark corner of my room, sinking to the floor, to remain entirely out of sight from the hallway window. My fingers were thick and clumsy, but I managed to dial a number I had committed to memory 2 decades ago. The phone rang 3 times before a sharp, awake voice answered. It was Warren Gallagher. Warren was my corporate attorney, a man possessing the moral flexibility of a starving shark and an absolute terrifying loyalty to my empire. I whispered his name into the receiver, my voice sounding like crushed gravel. I told him I was awake. I told him I needed an immediate injunction to freeze my assets, that Justin and Danielle were trying to murder me, and that Megan had stolen my master ledgers. I waited for Warren to spring into action, to tell me he was sending the authorities to my room to arrest them all. Instead, a heavy, dead silence filled the line. When Warren finally spoke, his words struck me harder than the heart attack itself. He told me I was too late. He explained that my children had not just been waiting around hoping for the best. 36 hours ago, they had marched into the county courthouse and filed a fully executed comprehensive power of attorney. The document was an immaculate forgery authorized by a bribed notary public, making it legally binding and deeply embedded in the county system. Warren warned me that if I hit the nurse call button right now and declared I was awake and coherent, my children would instantly deploy their trap. They would march into this hospital with their forged legal authority and declare that my heart trauma had caused severe neurological damage. They would tell the doctors I was suffering from paranoid delusions brought on by extreme oxygen deprivation. Because they held the medical proxy, the hospital would be legally obligated to believe them over me. They would trap me in a permanent conservatorship, drug me into actual compliance, and I would spend the rest of my miserably short life trapped in a psychiatric ward, while they liquidated my empire completely uncontested. I sat on the cold linoleum floor, clutching the stolen phone as the terrifying reality of my situation wrapped around my throat. I asked Warren what my options were. He told me the only way to dismantle a forged legal trap of this magnitude was from the absolute shadows. I could not fight them in the light because they legally owned the light. Warren gave me the most chilling advice I had ever received in my 63 years of life. He told me to put the monitor sensors back on my chest. He told me to lie back down, close my eyes, and play dead. I had to let them put me in the transport van tomorrow morning. I had to let my own children traffic me to their private, shadowy hospice facility. I had to walk willingly into the slaughterhouse because it was the absolute only place they would leave me unsupervised long enough for us to launch a coordinated counteroffensive. I hung up the phone, dragged my broken body back into the hospital bed, and reattached the wires. I closed my eyes as the sun began to rise, preparing to let the vultures carry me away. The vibration of the transport van rattled against my shattered chest for what felt like hours. I kept my eyes completely shut, letting my body roll limply with every pothole and sharp turn. The men loading me into the vehicle did not speak like medical professionals. They spoke like day laborers hauling a heavy, inconvenient piece of furniture. They joked about the football game they had missed the night before, complaining about the heavy rain expected that evening. There was no paramedic sitting beside me monitoring my fragile heart. I was simply cargo being delivered to a slaughterhouse. When the van finally stopped, the transition was seamless. I was wheeled out into the crisp morning air and then immediately pushed through a set of heavy automatic doors. The sharp, sterile scent of the state hospital was instantly replaced by the overwhelming aroma of artificial lavender and expensive cedar wood. It smelled like a high-end resort, but the absolute dead silence of the hallways told a different story. Real medical facilities hum with life, with the squeak of rubber soles, the frantic beeping of monitors, and the urgent whispers of nurses. This place was a tomb. It was a gilded cage designed to make murder look like a peaceful transition. They rolled me into a spacious suite. The mattress was incredibly soft, high-thread couch sheets pulled up to my chin, but I heard the heavy metallic thud of the door locking from the outside. I was alone for only a few minutes before the lock clicked again. I slowed my breathing to a shallow, rhythmic crawl, letting my jaw hang slack. I heard 2 sets of footsteps approach my bed. One was the heavy, confident stride of my son, Justin. The other was a softer, measured tread. Justin spoke first. His voice was cold and entirely transactional. He asked the man how long it would take for my heart to simply give out under the heavy sedation. The other man, who introduced himself as the head palliative care nurse, replied that they needed to be patient. He explained that a sudden massive overdose would flag the county coroner, even in a private facility like this one. He told my son that he would systematically increase my morphine drip over the next 48 hours. It would suppress my respiratory system completely. My oxygen levels would drop quietly, my damaged heart would slowly starve, and I would slip away in my sleep. Justin handed the man what sounded like a thick envelope of cash. He told the nurse to make sure I never woke up, and then he walked out, leaving me alone with my executioner. I felt the nurse step closer to the bed. He picked up my right arm, inspecting the intravenous port taped to the back of my hand. I could feel the cold plastic of a syringe pressing into the rubber valve of the IV line. My heart screamed to beat faster, to flood my veins with the adrenaline required to fight, but I forced my physical form into absolute submission. As the nurse pushed the plunger, injecting the heavy lethal dose of morphine into the primary tube, I shifted my body just an inch. Under the thick duvet, I rolled my left hand over and found the plastic tubing running up my arm. With every ounce of grip strength I had left from 40 years of hauling concrete and gripping bulldozer levers, I pinched the plastic tube completely shut. The pressure built instantly inside the line. I felt the liquid back up, expanding the plastic under my thumb, but I did not let go. I let out a long, trembling sigh, mimicking the physiological response of a dying man, sinking deep into chemical sedation. The nurse stood over me for 5 agonizing minutes, watching my chest rise and fall at a glacial pace. Satisfied that the poison was doing its work, he patted my shoulder mockingly, turned on his heel, and walked out of the suite, locking the heavy door behind him. The moment the room was empty, I pulled the IV needle clean out of my hand. I let the lethal dose of morphine bleed out into the mattress, hiding the wet stain beneath the heavy blankets. I wrapped my bleeding hand tightly in a piece of gauze from the bedside table. I lay there for hours, waiting for the sun to set and the facility to descend into the graveyard shift. The pain in my chest was blinding, a constant searing reminder of the cardiac event that had nearly killed me. But anger is a spectacular anesthetic. When the digital clock on the wall read 2 a.m, I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My knees buckled, but I caught myself on the wooden nightstand. I crept to the heavy door and pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. I tried the handle. It was locked electronically from the outside. I scanned the room. The air conditioning vent near the ceiling was secured with standard industrial screws. Using a heavy metal letter opener I found on the writing desk, I unscrewed the faceplate and used the heavy metal grate to smash the electronic strike plate of the door lock. The mechanism sparked, and the magnetic seal released with a soft click. I slipped into the hallway. The corridor was dimly lit, with plush carpets absorbing the sound of my bare feet. I navigated the shadows, moving toward the rear of the building. As I turned the corner near the utility wing, I saw him. A night shift janitor was aggressively buffing the floor, wearing a faded uniform and muttering curses under his breath about his miserable paycheck and the terrible management of the facility. He looked like a man who hated his employer more than he cared about the rules. I stepped out of the shadows. The man jumped, nearly dropping his floor buffer. Before he could shout, I raised my hand. I reached down to my ankle, where I had strapped my platinum Patek Philippe watch under my compression socks before the paramedics had taken me from my home days ago. Diane had given me that watch on our 30th anniversary. It was worth $40,000. It broke my heart to part with it, but sentimental value means nothing when you are fighting for your life. I held the heavy platinum timepiece out to the janitor. I told him the watch was his to keep. All he had to do was unlock the rear loading dock doors and look the other way for 10 minutes. The janitor stared at the glittering face of the watch, and then looked at my pale, battered face. He snatched the watch from my palm, shoved it deep into his pocket, and nodded toward the administration office. He told me the loading dock keycard was on the manager desk inside, and that he was going to take his break in the basement. I slipped into the dark administration office. The loading dock keycard rested exactly where he said it would, right next to an open, unattended computer terminal. The screen glowed softly, illuminating a stack of financial intake forms. I grabbed the keycard, but my eyes caught the logo on the computer screen. The facility was processing its nighttime data backups over an unsecured local network. I could not resist. I sat down in the leather chair and navigated to the corporate registry files saved on the desktop. I am a commercial real estate developer. I know exactly how to follow the money through the maze of corporate shell companies. I opened the property tax records for the hospice. The building was owned by an entity called Horizon Care, LLC. I ran that name through the state business portal tracing the parent company. Horizon Care was entirely owned by a private equity firm based out of Delaware. The name of the firm was Vanguard Capital. The air vanished from my lungs. Vanguard Capital was the vulture fund owned and operated by my son-in-law Chris, Danielle's husband. The scope of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the jaw. Chris was not just waiting around for his cut of my estate to cover his failing market bets. He was the architect of the slaughterhouse. He had built this off-the-grid facility using his investors' capital specifically to traffic high-net-worth individuals into the shadows where they could be quietly euthanized and their estates drained without public hospital oversight. Justin and Danielle had not merely found a shady hospice, they were literally paying Chris to murder me. The entire family was completely united in my execution. They had built a machine to grind up my life and split the profits. I closed out the browser, erasing my digital footprints completely. I grabbed the keycard, walked down the final corridor, and swiped the lock on the loading dock doors. The heavy metal rolled up, revealing the cold, unforgiving darkness of the early morning. I stepped out into the freezing rain, wearing nothing but hospital scrubs and a borrowed jacket I stole from a coat rack. I was dead to the world. My family believed I was currently suffocating under a heavy blanket of morphine. They thought they had won. They thought they had outsmarted the old man. I walked into the dark tree line, plotting my next move, knowing that when I returned from the grave, I would not just take back my empire. I was going to bury them in the very same shadows they tried to leave me in. The freezing rain soaked through the thin fabric of my stolen jacket within minutes. Every step I took along the shoulder of that deserted county highway sent a shockwave of agony through my damaged heart. I was a 63-year-old man, fresh out of a medically induced coma, walking through the dead of night with nothing but hospital scrubs and a burning desire for absolute vengeance. I kept to the shadows of the tree line, avoiding the headlights of passing freight trucks. I knew I needed to find a place to hide before the sun came up, and before the executioners at the hospice realized their target had walked right out the back door. 2 miles down the road, the neon sign of a dilapidated roadside motel flickered in the storm. It was the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour and did not ask questions if you paid in cash. I walked into the cramped lobby, shivering uncontrollably, leaving a trail of muddy water on the cheap linoleum floor. The night clerk barely looked up from his small television screen. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the only thing of value I had left on my person. It was my heavy gold wedding band. Diane had placed it on my finger 40 years ago. Taking it off felt like a physical betrayal, but I knew Diane would understand. She would have demanded I do whatever it took to destroy the monsters our children had become. I placed the ring on the counter. I told the clerk I needed a room at the very back of the lot for 3 days, and I needed him to forget he ever saw my face. He snatched the gold ring, handed me a brass key, and turned his eyes back to the television. Room number 12 smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. I locked the heavy wooden door, engaged the chain, and collapsed onto the sagging mattress. My chest throbbed with a terrifying intensity. I dragged myself to the bathroom, drank water straight from the rusty faucet, and waited for the sun to rise. At exactly 7 in the morning, I picked up the room telephone and dialed the direct private line of my corporate attorney, Warren Gallagher. I told him exactly where I was. An hour later, a sleek black town car pulled into the muddy parking lot. Warren stepped out wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than the entire motel. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and an expression of pure, restrained fury. When I opened the door, he stopped dead in his tracks. Seeing a billionaire commercial developer standing in muddy hospital scrubs, hiding in a cheap roadside motel, was a shock even for a man who had spent 30 years navigating the dark side of corporate law. Warren locked the door behind him, pulled the flimsy curtains shut, and placed his briefcase on the small circular table. He told me the situation was far worse than we had initially calculated. He explained that Justin and Danielle were not just acting recklessly. They were operating with terrifying legal precision. They had officially filed the forged power of attorney with the county clerk. Warren confirmed that the document gave them absolute total control over my personal banking, my medical decisions, and my entire real estate portfolio. I told Warren to freeze the bank accounts immediately. I told him to call the local authorities and have my son arrested for forgery and attempted murder. But Warren shook his head, his face grim and pale. He explained that if we triggered a massive legal alarm right now, we would lose the war. He laid out the grim reality of the legal system. If we froze the accounts, Justin and Danielle would immediately know I was alive and fighting back. Because they held a legally recognized power of attorney and a medical proxy, they would simply pivot their strategy. They would march into a civil courtroom, accompanied by the expensive lawyers funded by my son-in-law, Chris. They would claim that my heart attack had caused severe cognitive decline and paranoid delusions. They would argue that my attempt to freeze the accounts was proof of my mental instability. The court would side with the healthy, capable children holding the legal documents over the battered old man hiding in a motel. They would force me into a permanent conservatorship, drug me into silence, and legally drain my empire while I was trapped in a psychiatric ward. I sat on the edge of the bed, the cold reality washing over me. They had built a perfect, legally binding trap. If I stepped into the light, I would be crushed by the very system I had used to build my wealth. I looked at Warren, my vision narrowing with absolute clarity. I told him we were not going to fight them in the light. We were going to let them think they had total control. We were going to let them execute their grand plan to sell my primary commercial plaza to the Chicago investment firm. We were going to let them commit to the fraud so deeply that no expensive lawyer in the country could ever save them. Warren smiled. It was the cold, calculated smile of a legal shark smelling blood in the water. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of pristine legal documents. He told me that we could not freeze the accounts without triggering an alert, but we could completely hollow out the foundation of my empire from the inside. Warren proposed the immediate execution of an irrevocable blind trust based in Zurich, Switzerland. He explained the mechanics of the trap. We were going to digitally transfer the physical ownership deeds of every single commercial property I owned, including the 4th Street Plaza, directly into the offshore blind trust. Because Warren was the primary architect of my original estate planning, he had the legal authority to execute these emergency transfers using backdoor corporate channels that bypassed the standard county alert systems. The public-facing property records would take weeks to update. To the naked eye to Justin, and to the corporate buyers from Chicago, the properties would still appear to be registered in my name, but the reality was far more lethal. The moment I signed Warren's documents, the 4th Street Plaza no longer belonged to John Mercer. It belonged to an untouchable phantom entity in Zurich. I picked up the heavy fountain pen Warren offered me. My hand shook from the lingering weakness of my failing heart, but I gripped the pen with absolute, terrifying purpose. I signed my name, transferring $30 million of prime commercial real estate into the shadows. I transferred the warehouses, the residential complexes, and the empty development lots. In less than 20 minutes, I had legally reduced my personal net worth to zero. Warren gathered the signed documents and placed them carefully back into his briefcase. He explained exactly what was going to happen next. Justin and Danielle, firmly believing I was either dead or dying in their shadow hospice, would use their forged power of attorney to facilitate the sale of the 4th Street Plaza. They would sit in a luxurious boardroom, look the Chicago investors in the eye, and sign the closing documents to secure $30 million in liquid cash. But because I had just transferred the physical deed to Zurich, the plaza they were selling was legally worthless paper. They would be using a forged document to sell an asset they did not legally possess to a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. They would not just be committing a simple family betrayal. They would be committing massive, undeniable federal wire fraud and international corporate theft. When the Chicago firm eventually realized the deed was a phantom, they would not sue me. They would unleash a swarm of federal investigators directly onto Justin and Danielle. I leaned back against the cheap motel headboard, listening to the rain hammer against the window. My children thought they had trapped a dying old man. They thought they had outsmarted me by pushing me into the dark, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the dark. The dark was where I had built my empire 40 years ago. The dark was where I was most comfortable. I told Warren to file the Zurich documents immediately and to leave me in the motel. I had to remain a ghost for just a little while longer. The trap was set, the bait was perfectly positioned, and all I had to do now was wait in the shadows while my greedy, arrogant children walked willingly right off the edge of the cliff. I remained in the suffocating dampness of room 12. The rusted digital clock on the bedside table flipped to 3 in the morning. Warren had done his part transferring the physical deeds to Zurich. Now I had to do mine. Transferring the deeds was merely a legal shield. To truly destroy them, I had to make sure the Chicago investment firm ran away screaming from the 4th Street Plaza. If the Chicago buyers completed their due diligence and discovered the deed was already locked in a blind trust, the sale would simply fail. Justin and Danielle would walk away empty-handed, but legally safe. I did not want them safe. I wanted them desperate. I needed the Chicago investors to reject the property, not because of a title issue, but because they believed the property itself was a financial death trap. I needed to poison the well so thoroughly that my son-in-law, Chris, would be forced to drink from it himself. I picked up the prepaid burner phone and dialed a number I had not called in 15 years. The man who answered was named Leon. Leon was a retired municipal zoning inspector. 30 years ago, when he was a struggling junior inspector facing a massive medical bill for his youngest child, I paid the debt in full. I never asked for a favor in return. I never held it over his head. But tonight, I was calling to collect. I told Leon I needed a retroactive favor. I did not ask him to break the law. I asked him to creatively update the municipal database. I instructed Leon to log into the city zoning portal and attach a series of highly sensitive preliminary red flags to the 4th Street Plaza. I wanted anonymous complaints of deep soil groundwater contamination logged into the Environmental Protection Agency queue. I wanted structural integrity warnings citing black mold and failing foundational concrete attached to the most recent building inspection records. These were not official condemnations. They were radioactive whispers planted deep in the public records. Any corporate buyer running a standard due diligence background check would instantly see a property on the verge of being declared a federal toxic waste site. Leon hesitated for only a second before agreeing. He owed me his daughter's life. A few keystrokes in the dark were a small price to pay. By 9 in the morning, the digital traps were officially set and waiting. I sat on the edge of the sagging motel bed, staring at my laptop screen. I had accessed the security cameras installed throughout the 4th Street Plaza. These were hidden cameras I had personally wired into the main lobby and executive suites during the initial construction phase. My children had absolutely no idea they existed. The high-definition feed flickered to life, revealing the grand marble foyer. I watched as my son Justin strode into the lobby. He wore a sharp navy suit projecting the false confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. Beside him was Chris, my son-in-law, the slick corporate opportunist who ran his own private equity vulture fund. They were walking shoulder to shoulder with 3 executives from the Chicago investment firm. The Chicago buyers wore conservative suits and carried thick leather folios. They were ready to hand over $30 million in liquid cash. I watched the silent footage as Justin pointed to the vaulted glass ceilings and the bustling retail spaces below. He was selling my legacy with the casual arrogance of a thief hawking a stolen watch. But then the lead executive from Chicago received a phone call. I watched the man's face pale on the security feed. He listened intently, raising a hand to silence Justin mid-sentence. The executive ended the call and pulled a tablet from his briefcase. He turned the screen toward Justin and Chris. Even without audio, I knew exactly what they were looking at. The executive had just received the expedited due diligence report from his legal team. They had found Leon's radioactive red flags. They had seen the pending environmental contamination warnings and the structural failure notices. The Chicago executives did not ask questions. They did not negotiate for a lower price. Corporate investment firms do not touch properties burdened with potential federal environmental fines. The lead executive snapped his briefcase shut, shook his head in absolute disgust, and marched out of the lobby with his team trailing behind him. The security camera captured the pure, unadulterated panic washing over my son. Justin grabbed his hair, pacing frantically across the marble floor of the plaza lobby. He turned to Chris, waving his arms in desperation. I knew exactly why they were panicking. They needed liquid cash immediately. They were bleeding money trying to cover their tracks and whatever hidden debts they were drowning in. The Chicago deal was their golden parachute. Without that $30 million, their forged power of attorney was utterly useless. They were holding a ticking time bomb, and the timer had just hit 0. This was the exact moment the Hydra effect took hold. When you make a greedy man desperate, he does not retreat. He doubles down. I watched the security feed as Chris grabbed Justin by the shoulders, stopping his frantic pacing. Chris began speaking rapidly, gesturing to the empty plaza around them. I did not need to hear the words to understand the brilliant, catastrophic pivot Chris was proposing. Chris ran a private equity vulture fund built on acquiring distressed assets. He was looking at a commercial plaza that had just been falsely flagged as a toxic environmental hazard. To the Chicago buyers, it was a nightmare. To a vulture capitalist like Chris, it looked like an incredible opportunity to buy a prime asset at a rock-bottom distressed price. Chris was arrogant enough to believe he could navigate the municipal red tape and clear the environmental flags later, using his own corporate lawyers. But more importantly, Chris needed to keep the asset within the family to prevent their entire forgery scheme from collapsing. If they brought in outside buyers willing to overlook the toxic flags, those buyers might look too closely at the forged medical proxy. I watched as Chris pulled out his own phone, making a rapid series of calls. He was authorizing a massive transfer of capital. He was not using his own personal savings. He was tapping directly into his private equity fund. Chris was using millions of dollars of his investors' money to purchase the 4th Street Plaza directly from Justin. I closed the laptop and let out a harsh, raspy laugh that echoed off the peeling wallpaper of the motel room. The absolute poetic justice of their arrogance was staggering. Justin thought he was successfully liquidating my portfolio to save his own skin, getting the cash he so desperately craved. Chris thought he was executing a genius corporate maneuver, buying a prime distressed asset for pennies on the dollar using other people's money. They both thought they were winning the ultimate game of high-stakes family betrayal. They were completely oblivious to the lethal reality of the trap they had just slammed shut on their own necks. Chris had just wired millions of dollars of his client's investment capital to his brother-in-law. He had essentially purchased the 4th Street Plaza. But because Warren and I had already secretly transferred the physical deeds to a blind trust in Zurich, Chris had not bought a commercial plaza at all. Chris had just used his investors' money to purchase a legally worthless piece of paper. He had committed massive, undeniable corporate fraud to buy a phantom asset riddled with fake, toxic waste. They had tried to bury me alive, but they had just handed me the heavy steel shovels to dig their own federal graves. The rain outside my motel room had finally stopped, leaving behind a suffocating humidity that clung to the cheap walls. Chris and Justin had swallowed the bait. They had executed a fraudulent corporate buyout of a phantom asset. They were legally doomed. Yet sitting in the dim light of that miserable room, a nagging question continued to claw at the back of my mind. Greed is a powerful motivator, but greed alone is patient. Greed waits for the old man to naturally expire. What I had witnessed on that security feed was not just corporate ambition. It was blind, suffocating panic. Justin had acted with the erratic desperation of a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. I needed to know exactly who was holding that gun. I needed to understand the bleeding wound that had forced my son to sprint blindly into my trap. I knew Justin better than he knew himself. My son was arrogant and entitled, but he was fundamentally a coward. He lacked the nerve to initiate a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme purely on his own ambition. There had to be a driving force behind him, a puppet master pulling his strings and stoking his terror. That force was his wife, Megan. From the day Justin married her, I had recognized the cold, calculating ambition both hiding behind her designer dresses and rehearsed smiles. She was the one complaining about the smell of my hospital room. She was the one who looted my wall safe while my heart struggled to beat. If there was a fatal leak in their financial ship, Megan was the one holding the drill. I picked up my burner phone and made another call to the shadows. This time I did not call Warren. I needed someone completely disconnected from standard legal channels. I dialed a forensic accountant named Arthur Elias. Arthur was a ghost in the financial sector, a man who specialized in tracking dirty money across international borders for high-net-worth clients who preferred to keep their indiscretions out of the courtroom. I offered him $50,000 from my untouched Zurich reserves to perform a full, unauthorized deep dive into Megan's digital footprint. I did not want her public tax returns. I wanted the hidden transactions, the deleted routing numbers, the digital breadcrumbs she thought she had successfully swept under the rug. For 48 agonizing hours, I sat in that motel room, staring at the peeling paint on the ceiling. My chest ached with every breath, a constant physical reminder of my failing heart, but I refused to take the heavy painkillers. I needed my mind razor sharp. I existed on bitter black coffee and sheer willpower. Finally, my burner phone vibrated against the cheap laminate of the nightstand. It was an encrypted message from Arthur. The subject line was empty. The attached file contained 70 pages of complex international wire transfers, encrypted ledger entries, and offshore banking logs. I opened the file on my laptop and began to follow the money. What I found was a financial disaster of monumental proportions. Megan was not just a woman with expensive taste. She was a deeply entrenched compulsive gambler. But she was not betting on horses or pulling slot machines in a casino. She was submerged in a highly sophisticated illegal offshore sports betting syndicate based out of Macau. The ledgers painted a pathetic picture of a woman chasing her losses. Over the past 2 years, she had bled out hundreds of thousands of dollars betting on international football matches and underground fighting rings. And she had completely run out of luck. The encrypted communications Arthur had managed to intercept revealed the true source of Justin's absolute terror. Megan was currently $400,000 in debt to the syndicate. These were not men who sent polite collection notices in the mail. These were men who threatened to show up at your front door and break your spine. Justin was not trying to sell my commercial plaza just to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was trying to buy his wife's life back from international criminals. He was willing to murder his own father to pay off a gambling debt. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction reading those numbers. Their desperation made perfect sense now. They were cornered animals. But as I scrolled deeper into the forensic audit, my satisfaction evaporated instantly, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated fury. Arthur had not just found the debt. He had meticulously traced the origin of the seed money Megan had used to open her offshore betting accounts 2 years ago. The initial wire transfers had not come from Justin's salary. They had not come from her own savings. The routing numbers matched a highly restricted domestic account. It was the master account for the Diane Mercer Foundation. The air vanished from my lungs. The foundation was a pediatric cancer charity I had established immediately after my wife Diane passed away. I had funded it with $5 million of my own capital, specifically to honor her memory and her lifelong dedication to children. I had placed Justin and Megan on the board of directors, trusting them to manage the grants and oversee the charitable donations. I had handed them the keys to their mother's legacy, and Megan had used those keys to quietly embezzle $200,000 of pediatric cancer funds to place illegal bets on overseas blood sports. She had stolen from dying children to fund her addiction, and my son had covered it up. A profound, terrifying silence settled over the motel room. The beeping of the cars outside, the steady hum of the traffic, the throbbing pain in my own chest. Everything simply faded away. Up until this exact moment, my vengeance had been a cold corporate calculation. I was dismantling their finances because they had tried to steal mine. I was trapping them in legal fraud because they had forged my signature. It was a brutal game of chess, but reading the name of my dead wife on those embezzled bank transfers fundamentally changed the nature of this war. They had crossed the final sacred line. They had desecrated Diane's memory. The woman who had given them life, the woman who had nurtured and loved them unconditionally, had been reduced to a slush fund for a gambling addict. The very thought of it made my vision blur with a rage so intense it felt physical. I closed the laptop. My hands were no longer shaking. My heart beat with a slow, heavy, metallic rhythm. I was no longer a betrayed father trying to teach his greedy children a harsh lesson. I was the executioner. I was going to strip them of their freedom, their dignity, and their future. I would not just let them fall into the trap Chris had set. I was going to pour gasoline on the fire and burn their entire world to ashes. They wanted a dead man. I was going to give them a ghost that would haunt them for the rest of their miserable lives. I picked up the burner phone to make my next move. The time for passive traps was over. Total annihilation was the only appropriate response. I needed them to sprint directly into the federal trap. The revelation of my wife's desecrated charity had burned away any remaining shred of paternal hesitation. I was no longer manipulating property deeds or playing corporate chess. I was manipulating their perception of time. Desperate people make careless mistakes, but panicked people commit absolute atrocities. I needed Justin and Danielle to believe that their window of opportunity was slamming shut forever. I reached out to my corporate attorney, Warren Gallagher, and gave him a highly specific instruction. I needed a fabricated medical report, one that looked official enough to fool a corrupt hospice doctor who was already primed to expect my imminent demise. Warren utilized his extensive network of questionable medical experts. Within hours, a highly classified encrypted email breached the internal server of the shadow facility, where my family thought I was slowly suffocating to death. The digital document was a masterpiece of medical forgery. It contained perfectly calibrated blood panel results and fabricated toxicology screens indicating that my organs were in a state of cascading failure. The fake report concluded that my liver and kidneys had completely shut down due to the heavy morphine sedation and the initial cardiac trauma. It gave me an absolute maximum of 72 hours to live. I sat in my motel room monitoring the hacked communication lines of the hospice facility. It did not take long for the bait to be swallowed. At exactly 2 p.m, the corrupt head nurse, the same man who had pushed the lethal dose into my intravenous line, read the fake report. He immediately picked up the phone and dialed my son. I listened to the intercepted audio feed as Justin answered his cell phone. His voice carried the ragged, exhausting edge of a man who was already drowning in his own lies. The nurse did not waste time with pleasantries. He told Justin that my body was shutting down significantly faster than anticipated. He stated that the toxic buildup in my bloodstream was irreversible and that I would be officially pronounced dead before the weekend. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Justin asked if they could slow the process down, if they could buy him just a few more days to get his affairs in order. The nurse coldly replied that the process was entirely out of his hands now. The clock was ticking and it could not be stopped. Justin hung up the phone. Through a separate audio bug my investigator had managed to plant in his vehicle, I listened as the absolute reality of his situation crashed down around him. He immediately called his sister Danielle. His voice was trembling, bordering on sheer hysteria. He told her the old man was dying too fast. The timeline had completely collapsed. The commercial real estate deal had failed. Chris had bought the toxic plaza, but those funds were tied up in corporate escrow and would not clear for 30 days. They did not have 30 days. Megan owed $400,000 to men who broke bones for a living, and those men wanted their money by Friday. Chris needed an immediate capital injection to keep his private equity investors from discovering his own fraudulent maneuvers. My impending death meant my entire estate would instantly lock into probate. The forged power of attorney would become entirely legally useless the exact second my heart stopped beating. They needed liquid cash, and they needed it before I took my final breath. I listened as Danielle suggested the ultimate fatal mistake. She told Justin they had to leverage my personal assets. Not the commercial real estate, but my private, untouched wealth. The luxury residential properties, the classic car collection, the personal stock portfolios that I had kept completely separate from my corporate empire. Danielle told her brother that they could secure a massive bridge loan from a predatory private lender using the forged medical proxy and the fraudulent power of attorney. It was a staggering risk. Securing a corporate loan under a shell company was one thing, but personally signing for a multi-million-dollar private bank loan using forged documents was a direct, undeniable federal crime. But panic entirely overrides logic. Justin agreed. Less than 3 hours later, I watched the tracking beacon on Justin's vehicle move toward the financial district. They had arranged an emergency meeting with a private wealth lender known for asking very few questions, as long as the collateral was solid. My investigator was positioned in the lobby of the lending firm, sipping a coffee and recording the entire interaction through a hidden lapel camera. I watched the live feed on my laptop screen. Justin and Danielle walked into the glass-paneled office looking like perfectly put-together wealthy heirs. Megan walked slightly behind them, her hands trembling visibly, clearly terrified of the syndicate enforcers waiting for her payment. The lender, a slick man in a tailored suit, slid a massive stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany table. He explained that he was authorizing a $5 million expedited bridge loan secured directly against my personal residential estates and my private equity accounts. He looked at Justin and asked to see the primary authorization. Justin did not hesitate. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out the forged power of attorney. He handed the fraudulent document directly to the lender, claiming with absolute confidence that his father was completely incapacitated and that he possessed the sole legal authority to encumber the estate. The lender inspected the forged notary stamp and nodded in satisfaction. The lender handed Justin a heavy gold pen. I leaned closer to the laptop screen, my heart pounding with a slow, rhythmic intensity. I watched my son grip the pen. I watched him lean over the federal banking documents. He signed his name on the primary borrower line. He handed the pen to Danielle, and she signed her name directly below his acting as the secondary guarantor. They had just committed massive, documented, undeniable bank fraud. They had knowingly used a forged legal instrument to secure $5 million of federal funds under false pretenses. There were no corporate shell companies to hide behind anymore. There were no offshore trusts to blur the lines of responsibility. Their physical signatures were permanently inked onto federal banking records. The lender smiled and shook their hands, promising that the $5 million would be wired into their personal accounts by the following morning. Justin and Danielle walked out of the office, letting out heavy sighs of relief. They hugged each other in the lobby, believing they had just saved their entire miserable lives. They thought they had beaten the clock. They thought they had outsmarted the system and secured their stolen inheritance just moments before I supposedly took my last breath. They had absolutely no idea that they had just enthusiastically locked themselves inside a federal cage and handed me the only key. I closed my laptop in the dark motel room. The bait had been swallowed whole, and the hook was set deep in their throats. The morning sun broke through the grimy window of room 12, casting long shadows across my laptop screen. I had not slept. I was fueled by black coffee and the cold, intoxicating thrill of watching my enemies willingly step into the abyss. It was Tuesday. The private lender had promised Justin and Danielle that the $5 million would be liquid in their accounts by dawn. I sat wrapped in my stolen hospital jacket, my eyes fixed on the secure portal Warren had set up to monitor the banking activity linked to the forged power of attorney. The digital clock hit 8:00. A heavy silence filled the motel room, broken only by the distant hum of highway traffic. Then the screen blinked. A notification popped up in the corner of the portal. The $5 million had officially cleared the lender's escrow account, and landed in the primary joint account Justin and Danielle had set up specifically for this operation. For exactly 3 minutes, the money sat there. I could almost picture them standing in some pristine kitchen, staring at their phones, breathing heavy sighs of relief. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully leveraged a dying man to save their own miserable lives. But desperate people are incapable of patience. At exactly 8:04, the screen updated again. A massive wire transfer had been initiated. Justin was moving the funds out of the joint account. I leaned closer to the screen, watching the digital footprint of my son's panic. The $5 million did not stay in the state. It was not routed to local creditors to pay off Megan's gambling debt or to cover Chris's failing fund. Justin was wiring the entire sum directly into a corporate holding account registered in Delaware. The air in the motel room felt suddenly charged. I picked up the burner phone and dialed Warren. The line connected instantly. I told Warren that Justin had just initiated the wire transfer to the Delaware account. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Warren's voice was laced with a dark, terrifying satisfaction. He confirmed that Delaware was out of our current jurisdiction. By pushing those funds across state lines using the forged power of attorney, Justin had fundamentally altered the nature of the crime. This was the exact moment the trap snapped shut. A local civil dispute over a forged document would have been handled by county judges and local police. It would have been a messy, drawn-out affair with high-priced lawyers arguing over intent and cognitive capacity. But the moment that $5 million crossed a state border, the jurisdiction instantly shifted. It was no longer a state-level issue. It was wire fraud. It was a federal felony of the highest order. The federal government does not negotiate intent. They do not care about family drama or cognitive capacity. They care about the movement of illicit funds across their borders. I watched the screen as the transaction completed. The money vanished from the local account and settled into the Delaware holding company. Justin and Danielle had just permanently inked their names onto a federal crime. I asked Warren who the Delaware account belonged to. The answer was the final piece of the puzzle I needed to complete their annihilation. Warren explained that the Delaware account was not a general holding fund. It was the primary operating account for Vanguard Capital, the private equity firm owned and operated by my son-in-law, Chris. The scope of their betrayal was staggering. Justin and Danielle had not merely secured a loan to save themselves. They had wired the entire $5 million directly to Chris. They had essentially handed the stolen money straight to the architect of the shadow hospice where they thought I was currently dying. The family syndicate was operating with a ruthless efficiency, transferring funds to cover Chris's failing bets while ignoring Megan's dangerous syndicate debt. The infighting and the secrets were rotting them from the inside out. I did not pause to revel in their mistakes. I had a very specific contact waiting in the shadows. 10 years ago, when I was developing a massive commercial sector downtown, I had assisted a federal task force in tracing laundered money in through a corrupt construction firm. The lead agent on that case, a man named Robert, had given me a direct encrypted email address for emergencies. I opened a secure browser window and attached the digital files Warren had compiled. I attached the forged power of attorney, highlighting the fraudulent notary stamp. I attached the wire transfer receipts proving the movement of the $5 million across state lines into Vanguard Capital. I attached the IP addresses showing exactly where Justin had initiated the transfer. I typed a brief message to Robert, explaining that a massive federal wire fraud had just occurred involving a forged medical proxy and a multi-million-dollar private equity fund. I hit send. The files vanished into the secure servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the damp room. My children had spent months planning my demise. They had calculated my assets, forged my signature, and pushed me into the dark. But they had failed to understand that the system they were trying to exploit was a machine designed to crush anyone foolish enough to challenge its borders. By involving federal lines and private equity funds, they had triggered an unstoppable force. The FBI would not call them for a polite meeting. They would not ask for their side of the story. They would quietly build an ironclad case tracking every single dollar, tracing every IP address, and gathering the financial rope needed to hang them all. I sat back against the cheap headboard, listening to the rain begin to fall again. The federal wheels were turning. The investigation was officially out of my hands and out of the control of my children's expensive lawyers. They thought they had secured their future, but they had just signed a long-term lease in a federal penitentiary. The beauty of the Hydra effect is that the monster does not know it is dead until the final head is severed. They were currently celebrating a multi-million-dollar victory, completely unaware that federal agents were already reading their names on wire transfer receipts. The silent destruction of my treacherous family was finally in motion. The federal government moves with the agonizing pace of a glacier. I knew the Financial Crimes Division was meticulously building their case, but federal indictments take weeks to fall. I sat in my motel room staring at the peeling wallpaper, listening to the relentless rain. I had ensured my children would eventually lose their freedom, but I was not content to let them spend their final days of liberty celebrating their supposed victory. I wanted to break them psychologically. I wanted to watch the disease of paranoia rot their alliance from the inside out before the agents ever kicked down their doors. A criminal syndicate is only as strong as the trust between its members, and I knew exactly where to strike to shatter that trust completely. My forensic accountant, Arthur Elias, delivered the weapon I needed. While tracking the $5 million that Justin had wired to Delaware, Arthur uncovered a secondary, highly concealed routing maneuver. Chris, my slick son-in-law, had not left the stolen funds resting in his private equity operating account. The moment the money hit his firm, Chris sliced off $4 million and bounced it through 3 different shell companies, finally parking it in a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. The account did not belong to the firm. It did not belong to Danielle. The offshore vault was registered to a sole proprietor. Chris had taken the money my children committed federal fraud to secure, and he had quietly locked it away for himself. He was preparing to abandon them the moment the ship started taking on water. I did not send an email or a text message. Digital traces can be dismissed or manipulated. I wanted tactile, undeniable proof. I had Warren compile the banking logs, the offshore routing numbers, and the sole proprietorship registration into a thick, unmarked manila envelope. I hired a private courier with strict instructions. At exactly 1 p.m, the courier approached a high-end bistro downtown, where Danielle was having lunch with her country club friends, likely spending money she thought she had just stolen from a dying man. The courier handed her the envelope and walked away without a single word. Through the audio bug my investigator had previously planted in her designer handbag, I listened as she tore open the seal. The cheerful chatter of her lunch dates faded into the background as Danielle processed the financial documents. I heard her breath hitch. I heard the sharp, terrifying silence of a woman who, realizing her own husband had just robbed her blind. She excused herself from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. As she rushed out to the street, she immediately dialed Justin. Her voice was not the practiced, arrogant tone she used in the hospital room. It was a shrill, hysterical shriek. She told her brother that the money was gone. She explained that Chris had siphoned $4 million into a private Cayman vault and cut them out entirely. Justin demanded to know where she got the documents, but Danielle was too hysterical to care about the source. She only cared that they had risked decades in federal prison for a payout that no longer existed. The paranoia ignited like dry brush soaked in gasoline. Justin told his sister to meet him at the upscale steakhouse where Chris was currently having a celebratory lunch with his firm partners. I opened my laptop and tapped into the security cameras of the steakhouse parking lot, a system I had access to because my company owned the commercial plaza where the restaurant was leased. I watched the live feed as Justin drove his luxury vehicle erratically into the lot, parking diagonally across 2 spaces. Danielle arrived moments later, clutching the manila folder against her chest like a shield. They did not walk into the restaurant. They waited by the imported sports car belonging to Chris, pacing the asphalt like caged, starving animals. 20 minutes later, Chris strolled out of the restaurant doors, laughing with two of his corporate partners. He was wearing a tailored suit, looking like a man who had just conquered the world. The smile vanished the second he saw his wife and brother-in-law waiting by his car. Justin did not wait for an explanation. The coward I had raised finally found his nerve fueled entirely by the terrifying realization that he had been played for a fool. Before Chris could even open his mouth, Justin lunged forward. He grabbed Chris by the lapels of his expensive suit and slammed him violently against the hood of the sports car. The corporate partners backed away in shock as Justin drove his fist directly into his brother-in-law. Chris collapsed onto the wet pavement, clutching his bleeding face. Justin stood over him, screaming obscenities, demanding the routing numbers to the Cayman account. Danielle did not try to stop the violence. Instead, she leaned over her bleeding husband and unleashed the most profoundly ironic threat I had ever heard. With her voice echoing across the parking lot, Danielle screamed that she was going to call the police. She threatened to march straight to the authorities and report Chris for embezzlement and grand larceny. In her blind, suffocating rage, she had completely forgotten the reality of her own situation. She had forgotten that the money Chris stole was money she had obtained by forging a medical proxy and signing fraudulent federal banking documents. She was threatening to call the police to report the theft of stolen funds, entirely oblivious to the fact that initiating any official investigation would instantly result in her own arrest for federal wire fraud. She was willing to burn herself alive just to ensure her husband caught fire too. Chris spat blood onto the pavement and laughed a cruel, mocking sound that cut through the tension. He looked up at his wife and told her to go ahead and call the cops, reminding her that her signature was the one permanently inked on the fraudulent bridge loan. I watched the three of them standing in the parking lot, completely paralyzed by their own toxic web. Justin was breathing heavily, his knuckles bleeding. Danielle was sobbing hysterically, finally understanding that she was trapped in a cage with no exit. Chris was nursing a shattered jaw, realizing his brilliant exit strategy had just imploded in plain sight. The absolute trust required to maintain a criminal conspiracy had evaporated in less than an hour. They were no longer a unified family trying to euthanize an old man. They were three cornered rats ready to chew each other to pieces just to survive the sinking ship. I closed the laptop screen, a cold satisfaction settling deep in my chest. The psychological warfare had executed flawlessly. I had given them a massive, unearned victory only to snatch the prize away and watch them tear out each other to find it. They would spend the next few days unable to sleep, unable to trust the person sitting across the dinner table, jumping at every shadow and every ringing phone. The authorities were coming for them, but the agents would not find a cohesive family ready to mount a strong legal defense. The federal agents would find a fractured, bleeding, paranoid mess of individuals perfectly primed to turn state evidence against one another. The empire of deceit was collapsing from the inside out, and I had not even raised my voice. The psychological cracks in my family's syndicate were beginning to show, but I needed a definitive shattering. I needed a moment so profoundly public, so saturated in hypocrisy, that their eventual downfall would echo through the very social circles they sought to impress. It was time for John Mercer to officially die. At 6 a.m. on a bleak Thursday morning, I sat in Warren's mahogany-paneled office sipping black coffee. Warren dialed Justin's number. He placed the phone on speaker. I listened as my son answered, his voice thick with sleep and the lingering paranoia of the last few days. Warren's tone was a masterclass in professional solemnity. He informed Justin that he had just received a call from the administration at Horizon Care. I had passed away during the night. Warren explained that my body had already been transferred to a private mortuary per the specific instructions in my advance directives Warren had naturally fabricated. I heard Justin's breath catch. It wasn't a gasp of sorrow. It was the sharp inhalation of a man realizing his ultimate payday had arrived. He didn't ask about my final moments. He didn't ask if I was in pain. His immediate response was to ask Warren when the estate would clear probate. Warren, ever the calculating shark, assured him the process was underway and advised the family to focus on memorial arrangements. The news acted like a temporary adhesive on their fractured alliance. The infighting, the parking lot, brawls, the threats of police involvement. It all vanished under the intoxicating promise of immediate liquid wealth. They dropped their civil war to focus on the performance of a lifetime. They didn't arrange a quiet, dignified farewell. They orchestrated a high society spectacle. They booked the grand ballroom at the city's most exclusive country club, a venue I had explicitly despised during my life. It was a calculated move to solidify their status among the city's elite, to present themselves as the grieving heirs to a massive commercial empire ready to step into my shoes. The memorial was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. Through Warren's extensive network, we secured the catering contract for the event. I wasn't going to miss my own funeral. I needed to witness their final act of deception before I brought the curtain down. I arrived at the country club 3 hours early, dressed in the stark white uniform of a catering vendor. I wore a low-brimmed cap and thick, dark-rimmed glasses. The physical transformation of the last few weeks, the weight loss, the pale complexion, the exhaustion served as a natural disguise. I was a ghost blending into the background of my own memorial. I positioned myself behind a towering floral arrangement near the rear entrance of the ballroom, a perfect vantage point to observe the arrivals. The room was a sea of black designer suits and subtle, expensive jewelry. My children had spared no expense. There were ice sculptures, a string quartet playing melancholic classical pieces, and an open bar serving premium spirits. It was a celebration of their greed, funded by the very estate they thought they had stolen. Justin stood near the front, shaking hands with city council members and rival developers. He wore a somber expression, accepting their condolences with slow, measured nods. He was playing the role of the stoic son, carrying the heavy burden of his father's legacy. Danielle was holding court near the center of the room. She was wiping away non-existent tears with a lace handkerchief, recounting fabricated stories of my final days. She spoke of our supposed deep connection, of how much I loved her, of how peacefully I had slipped away. I watched her dab her dry eyes, disgusted by the sheer audacity of her performance. Chris, my slick son-in-law, hovered near the bar. He wasn't grieving, he was networking. I watched him smoothly transition from accepting condolences to pitching his private equity fund to wealthy attendees. He was leveraging my death to secure new investors, completely unaware that his firm was currently suffocating under a massive federal investigation. Megan, Justin's wife, sat quietly in a corner sipping a martini. She looked terrified, constantly checking her phone, likely waiting for a threatening message from her illegal betting syndicate. She was the only one who seemed genuinely distressed, but her fear had nothing to do with my passing. The eulogies began. The hypocrisy reached a sickening crescendo. Justin stepped up to the podium. He spoke of my dedication, my hard work, and the unyielding love I had for my family. He told the crowd that I had been his greatest mentor, that he would spend the rest of his life striving to honor my memory. I tightened my grip on the serving tray I was holding. He was eulogizing a man he had actively tried to murder for a quick payout. Danielle followed. She shared a touching, entirely fictional anecdote about a childhood memory, painting a picture of a doting father and his precious daughter. She concluded her speech by saying that she found comfort in knowing I was finally at peace, free from suffering. I watched the audience dab their eyes, completely taken in by her crocodile tears. I remained motionless in the shadows, absorbing every lie, every false tear, every moment of their grotesque performance. They were celebrating a victory that did not exist. They were basking in the glow of an inheritance they had already lost. They believed they were the smartest people in the room, outmaneuvering the system and securing their financial future. I knew the truth. I knew that the commercial plaza they thought they were selling was a legally worthless phantom. I knew that the $5 million bridge loan they had signed for was a massive documented federal crime. I knew that the FBI was meticulously building a case that would destroy them all. As the memorial concluded and the guests began to filter out, I watched my children gather near the front of the room. They dropped their somber facades the moment the last important guest departed. Justin let out a sharp, genuine laugh. Danielle smirked, adjusting her designer dress. They exchanged a look of pure, triumphant greed. They thought it was over. They thought the old man was dead and buried. They had no idea that the real funeral was just beginning, and they were the ones who would soon be laid to rest. I slipped out the service entrance, shedding the catering uniform. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was primed. It was time for the dead man to walk into the light and deliver the final crushing blow. The air in Warren Gallagher's boardroom was thick with an expensive manufactured grief. The walls were lined with dark mahogany, giving the space the solemnity of a tomb, which was perfectly appropriate for what was about to happen. Through a small mirrored observation panel in the adjoining antechamber, I stood in the dark, watching my family gather around the massive conference table. It had been exactly 5 days since they thought they had watched me die. Justin was the first to arrive. He was wearing a custom-tailored black suit that probably cost more than my first car. He shook Warren's hand with a firm, practiced grip, his face arranged in a mask of stoic sorrow. But his eyes were darting around the room, vibrating with an impatient, greedy energy. He wasn't here to mourn. He was here to collect. Danielle and Chris walked in next. Danielle was dressed in head-to-toe designer black, clutching a tissue she hadn't shed a single tear into. Chris, my vulture of a son-in-law, looked surprisingly tense. He took a seat at the far end of the table, avoiding eye contact with Justin. The parking lot brawl from 2 days ago had clearly left a lasting, paranoid divide between them, but the promise of a $12 million payout had forced a temporary truce. Megan, Justin's wife, arrived last. She looked physically ill. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her chair, her eyes flicking toward the door every few seconds. She knew the offshore syndicate was running out of patience. She needed this money today, or she wouldn't survive the week. Warren sat at the head of the table. He didn't offer any warm condolences. He didn't serve them tea. He simply opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed document. I leaned closer to the observation glass. The trap I had spent the last 2 weeks meticulously building was finally springing shut. Warren adjusted his glasses and looked down the table. "We are gathered here for the formal reading of the last will and testament of John Thomas Mercer." He began, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Before we proceed to the specific distributions, I am legally obligated to read the preliminary declarations." Justin shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly. "Of course, Warren. Please go ahead. We just want to get this difficult process over with to honor his memory." The sheer audacity of his lie made my jaw tighten. Warren broke the seal on the folder. "As the executor of this estate, I must first inform you of a significant structural change to Mr. Mercer's portfolio. 2 weeks prior to his passing, John Mercer executed a comprehensive, irrevocable transfer of assets." The room instantly went completely still. Justin stopped, leaning forward. Chris's head snapped up. "What kind of transfer?" Danielle asked, her voice losing its practiced softness, a sharp edge of panic bleeding through. Warren didn't look up from the document. "All physical real estate deeds, including the primary 4th Street commercial plaza, the residential complexes, and the undeveloped municipal lots, were legally removed from the personal estate. They were transferred in their entirety to an offshore blind trust based in Zurich, Switzerland. The estate before you today currently holds 0 physical property." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the terrifying, suffocating silence of an airplane engine stalling at 30,000 feet. "That is impossible," Justin stammered, the color completely draining from his face. We have the deeds. I have the power of attorney. We just leveraged the 4th Street Plaza." Warren finally looked up, his eyes locking onto my son. "You attempted to leverage it, Justin. But you cannot leverage an asset your father did not legally own at the time of the transaction. The commercial plaza belonged to the Zurich Trust. The property you attempted to sell to the Chicago firm and the property you ultimately transferred to Vanguard Capital was a legally worthless phantom. Chris stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair crashed backward onto the floor. "You're telling me," Chris shouted, his voice cracking with absolute terror, "that I just used my investor's capital to buy a building that doesn't exist in the portfolio?" "That is precisely what I am telling you," Warren replied calmly. Danielle was hyperventilating now, clutching the edge of the mahogany table. But the bridge loan?" she gasped. "We signed for a $5 million bridge loan against his personal assets. We wired that money out. If the estate is empty, how is the estate going to pay back the loan?" This was the moment. This was the exact lethal strike of the Hydra. Warren turned the page of the will. "That brings me to the secondary declaration," he said, his voice cutting through their rising panic like a scalpel. "Clause 4 of the updated will explicitly addresses the power of attorney you filed." Justin looked like he was going to be sick. He was staring at his hands, watching them tremble against the polished wood. The clause states, Warren read, that any financial debt loan or encumbrance initiated under the authority of a power of attorney within 30 days of my death is entirely excluded from the estate's liabilities. The estate will not absorb, acknowledge, or pay these debts. They are explicitly designated as the sole personal legal responsibility of the signatories. Megan let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "No," she cried, burying her face in her hands. "No, no, no." Warren closed the folder and folded his hands on the table. "To summarize," he said, looking at the 4 broken people sitting before him, "the $12 million estate you were expecting does not exist. What does exist is a $5 million federal bank loan. Because you, Justin, and you, Danielle, signed that loan personally, and because the estate legally refuses the debt, you are both personally liable for the full $5 million immediately." "We didn't keep the money," Danielle screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at Chris. "He took it. He wired it to a private account in the Cayman Islands. You have to go after him." Chris lunged across the table, grabbing Danielle's wrist. "Shut your mouth," he hissed, his eyes wild with the realization that she was confessing to federal wire fraud in front of a corporate attorney. "I don't care about the money anymore," Megan wailed, rocking back and forth in her chair. "They are going to kill me. The syndicate is going to kill me by Friday." They were completely unraveling. The arrogant, unified family that had stood over my hospital bed and ordered my death had shattered into 4 terrified, desperate criminals turning on each other in a corporate boardroom. They hadn't inherited an empire. They had inherited a federal prison sentence and a massive unpayable debt. Justin slammed his fists onto the table, his face red with rage and fear. "This is a setup," he roared. "The will is a fake. The old man was a vegetable. He couldn't have executed a blind trust. I demand to see the signatures. I'm going to sue this entire firm to the ground." I placed my hand on the brass handle of the observation room door. They had dug their own graves, climbed inside, and pulled the dirt down on top of themselves. It was time to show them exactly who was holding the shovel. The mahogany-paneled boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. Justin slammed his fists against the polished table, screaming that the document was a complete fabrication. He yelled that I was a dying old man, incapable of executing a blind trust, and that he would drag Warren through every court in the state. Chris, my slick son-in-law, was pacing like a caged animal, threatening to unleash an army of corporate litigators against the firm. Danielle was sobbing hysterically, pointing a manicured finger at Chris and accusing him of stealing the money they had risked everything to get. Megan sat frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the wall, likely calculating how many hours she had left before the syndicate enforcers found her. They were tearing each other apart, right there in the boardroom, completely unraveling under the weight of their own greed. It was a beautiful symphony of destruction. I stood in the antechamber, watching through the observation glass, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline course through my veins. I had spent 40 years building an empire, but this was my masterpiece. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the oak doors. I pushed the doors open. The heavy wood swung silently on its hinges. I stepped into the boardroom, the soft click of my expensive leather shoes echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence. I didn't look like a dying man who had just escaped a shadow hospice. I looked like John Mercer, the ruthless commercial developer who had crushed competitors and built a fortune from the ground up. The color drained from Justin's face so fast, he looked like a corpse. Danielle let out a strangled gasp, clamping her hands over her mouth. Chris stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of a leather chair. Megan simply stared at me, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it almost looked like madness. They had watched me die. They had stood in a hospital room and ordered my execution. They had just spent the entire afternoon accepting condolences at a high society memorial service. And now the dead man was standing right in front of them. I didn't yell. I didn't point fingers. I didn't even acknowledge their panic. I walked slowly, methodically toward the center of the massive table. I pulled a small digital voice recorder from my breast pocket. The metallic click of the device hitting the polished mahogany sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I pressed play. The crisp, clear audio of the hospital room filled the boardroom. Justin's voice, arrogant and detached, echoed off the walls instructing the doctor to establish a strict, "do not resuscitate" order. Danielle's fake, sympathetic tone followed, demanding a transition to palliative comfort care. Then the sickening conspiratorial whispers began. Justin explaining how they could execute the sale of the commercial plaza the moment I was declared incompetent. Danielle laughing that greedy, horrifying laugh, talking about Chris's failing investment fund and the need for liquid cash. I watched their faces as their own voices convicted them. Justin sank slowly into his chair, his eyes fixed on the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. Danielle was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. Chris looked like a man who had just realized the parachute he packed was full of holes. He realized he had just used his investors' money to buy a worthless phantom asset to cover a crime that was now playing out on tape. The recording ended with the sharp click of the hospital door closing. The silence rushed back into the room, heavier and more toxic than before. I looked at Justin. My son, the boy I had raised, the man who had just spent an hour eulogizing me at a country club. I told him that I had been awake the entire time. I told him that I had heard every single word. I told him that I had lay in that hospital bed pretending to be unconscious while my own children planned my murder and the theft of my legacy. Justin opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely broken, a coward exposed in the harsh light of reality. I turned to Danielle. I asked her if she had enjoyed the memorial service. I asked her if she felt a twinge of guilt when she stood in front of the city's elite and lied through her teeth. She couldn't even look at me. She stared at her lap, a pathetic picture of a woman who had traded her soul for a payout that didn't exist. I looked at Chris. I told him that the 4th Street Plaza was a beautiful piece of architecture, but that it belonged to a blind trust in Zurich. I told him that he had just committed massive federal wire fraud using his private equity fund to purchase a legally worthless piece of paper. I told him that the FBI was likely already freezing his accounts and preparing the indictments. Chris collapsed into the chair, his head falling into his hands, a slick opportunist finally caught in a trap he couldn't charm his way out of. Finally, I looked at Megan, the woman who had complained about the smell of my hospital room while looting my safe. I told her that I knew about the $400,000 debt to the offshore syndicate. I told her that I knew she had embezzled the initial funds from the Diane Mercer Foundation. The mention of my late wife's name was a deliberate final strike. Megan let out a soft, whimpering sound, the sound of a desperate addict who had just run out of lies. They had tried to bury me alive. They had tried to push me into the shadows, but they had failed to understand that the dark was where I had built my empire. The dark was where I was most comfortable. I had let them dig their own graves, climb inside, and pull the dirt down on top of themselves. And now the dead man was standing over them, holding the shovel. The sound of the digital recorder clicking off was the loudest noise in that mahogany-paneled room. For a fraction of a second, nobody breathed. Then Megan broke. It was not a delicate or graceful weep. It was a visceral, hysterical sob that tore from her throat as she collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved as the absolute reality of her situation crushed her. She was a woman who had stood in my hospital room complaining about the smell of sickness while plotting to steal my legacy, and now she was drowning in the consequences. Justin, the boy I had raised to be a leader, instantly reverted to his most pathetic, cowardly instincts. He stumbled backward away from the conference table, pointing a trembling finger directly at his brother-in-law. He started screaming that none of this was his fault. He claimed that Chris had orchestrated the entire operation. He yelled that Chris had found the shadow hospice, that Chris had demanded they forge the power of attorney, and that Chris was the one pressuring them for the liquid cash. Chris did not take the accusation quietly. The slick private equity manager bared his teeth like a cornered animal and lunged toward Justin. He shouted that Justin was a weak, spineless fool who had happily signed the federal banking documents. The two men who had conspired to murder me for my wealth were now standing inches apart, spitting venom, and preparing to physically tear each other to pieces in Warren Gallagher's pristine boardroom. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply spoke in a cold, measured tone that instantly froze the air in the room. I told them to sit down. The sheer authority in my voice forced them back into their heavy leather chairs. They looked at me with the terrified obedience of condemned prisoners facing their executioner. I turned my gaze to Chris. I told him he fancied himself a corporate genius, a vulture capitalist who preyed on the weak. I methodically explained exactly how I had weaponized his arrogance against him. I detailed the late-night phone call to a retired municipal inspector. I explained how I had ordered the planting of fake environmental contamination flags and fabricated structural failure notices deep within the city. Zoning files for the 4th Street Commercial Plaza. I watched the color drain completely from Chris's face as he realized the Chicago investors had not pulled out due to market volatility. They had fled because I made the property look like a federal toxic waste site. And Chris, in his blind greed, had rushed in to buy a distressed asset using his own client's money. I leaned forward and reminded him that the physical deed to that plaza already belonged to a blind trust in Zurich. He had wired millions of his investors' dollars to Justin to purchase a phantom asset that was legally worthless. Next, I shifted my attention to my son. Justin flinched as if I had struck him. I laid out the catastrophic legal reality of the $5 million bridge loan. I explained that sneaking into a private lending firm and presenting a forged medical proxy to secure a local loan was a terrible crime, but transferring those stolen funds across state lines to a corporate holding account in Delaware elevated his greed to a massive federal felony. I watched his eyes widen in unadulterated horror as I confirmed that I had personally sent the IP addresses, the fraudulent notary stamps, and the wire transfer receipts directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal government was already preparing the indictments. Then I looked at Megan. The room grew so quiet I could hear her ragged, shallow breaths. I did not speak of real estate or federal wire fraud. I spoke of Diane. I spoke of the Pediatric Cancer Foundation I had built in my late wife's honor to bring light to dying children. I told Megan that I had hired a ghost of a forensic accountant to track her digital footprints. I detailed her staggering debt to the illegal sports betting syndicate in Macau. I watched her completely shatter as I explicitly revealed that she had embezzled the foundational seed money from Diane's charity to fund her degenerate gambling addiction. I told her that she had desecrated the memory of the woman who had welcomed her into this family. There would be no mercy for her. The crushing weight of my methodical breakdown pushed Danielle to her breaking point. My daughter, the woman who had laughed about my impending death in the intensive care unit, suddenly dropped to her knees on the expensive carpet. She crawled toward where I stood. She reached out with trembling hands and grasped the edge of my tailored suit jacket. Tears poured down her cheeks, ruining her immaculate makeup. She began to beg for forgiveness, playing the ultimate victim card. She sobbed that she was terrified that Chris and Justin had manipulated her into going along with the plan. She pleaded for my legendary mercy, swearing that she loved me and that she was only trying to hold her marriage together under extreme financial stress. I looked down at her grasping hands and felt absolutely nothing. I gently but firmly pulled my jacket away from her grip and took a step back. I reached into my leather portfolio resting on the table and extracted a thick, unmarked manila folder. I slid it across the polished mahogany surface until it stopped directly in front of her tear-stained face. I told Danielle that her performance was a waste of breath because the men she was currently blaming were actively planning to leave her holding the bag. I instructed her to open the folder. Danielle, with shaking fingers, broke the seal and spread the documents across the table. I explained exactly what Arthur Elias had uncovered. I pointed to the offshore routing logs that proved Chris had not kept the stolen $5 million in his private equity operating account. The moment Justin wired the funds, Chris had sliced off $4 million and bounced it through a maze of shell companies. I pointed to the final destination, a numbered vault in the Cayman Islands registered to a sole proprietorship belonging exclusively to Chris. He was preparing to vanish with the stolen cash the second the federal authorities came knocking, leaving Justin and Danielle to take the fall for the forged signatures. Danielle's weeping stopped instantly. Her face contorted from pathetic sorrow into pure venomous shock as she slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Chris refused to meet her gaze, staring firmly at the floor, confirming his guilt. But I was not finished. I turned to Justin, who was looking at Chris with murderous intent. I told my son to look at the second stack of papers in the folder. I explained that Justin thought the fraudulent bridge loan was going to save them. He believed the money would cover his own reckless debts and secure their future. I revealed that he was completely unaware his wife Megan was currently $400,000 in debt to men who break bones for a living. I told Justin that Megan had pulled him into a conspiracy to murder his own father, not to build a wealthy life together, but to save her own skin from international syndicate enforcers who were demanding payment by Friday. Justin slowly turned his head to look at the woman he had married. Megan could only sob, hiding her face behind her trembling hands. The beautiful absolute destruction of their syndicate was complete. They were not merely murderers and thieves who had plotted against me. They were traitors to one another. They had conspired in the dark only to stab each other in the back the moment the money materialized. The room descended into a toxic, paranoid silence. The realization of their mutual betrayal hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They realized they were trapped in a cage with the very people who had sold them out. I stood tall at the head of the boardroom, watching the ashes of their alliances blow away. They had nothing left. No empire, no wealth, no family, and no trust. I had stripped them of everything they valued, and I had done it simply by handing them the truth. The suffocating silence in the boardroom finally shattered. It did not break with a desperate plea for forgiveness or a sudden burst of violent rage. It broke with the frantic scraping of expensive leather against hardwood. Justin, the son I had molded to take over an empire, reverted to the primal instinct of a cornered animal. He looked at his wife Megan, trembling violently in her chair. He looked at his sister Danielle, weeping over the proof of her husband's betrayal. He looked at Chris, the vulture capitalist, now drowning in federal exposure. In that fraction of a second, Justin made the ultimate coward's calculation. He abandoned them all. He lunged out of his chair, his eyes wide with blind panic, and sprinted toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. Danielle screamed his name, a pathetic, ragged sound, begging her brother not to leave her behind. Justin ignored her completely. He was a man consumed by the desperate, foolish belief that if he could just make it to the elevator, if he could just get to his imported car in the subterranean parking garage, he could somehow outrun a federal indictment. I did not move a single muscle. I stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, my hands resting calmly by my sides. I did not shout for him to stop. I did not command Warren to block the exit. I simply watched my son grab the heavy brass handles with sweating, trembling hands. He threw his entire body weight backward, pulling the massive doors wide open, fully expecting to sprint into the quiet, carpeted sanctuary of the law firm's antechamber. Instead, he slammed directly into a solid wall of dark tactical windbreakers. The pristine corporate lobby had been entirely commandeered. Standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking every conceivable avenue of escape, were 12 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. The yellow letters spelling out FBI across their jackets stood out in stark, terrifying contrast against the muted, elegant decor of Warren Gallagher's firm. Standing at the center of the formation was Special Agent Robert, the contact I had forwarded the wire transfer receipts to just days prior. Robert did not blink as Justin bounced off the chest of a towering agent and stumbled backward into the boardroom. The federal agents flooded into the room, their movements precise, silent, and overwhelmingly lethal. The trap had not just closed, it had completely swallowed them whole. I had timed the reading of the will with absolute surgical precision. While Warren was meticulously dismantling their financial expectations inside the boardroom, Robert and his team were executing a coordinated multi-agency raid. They had already seized Chris's private equity servers in Delaware. They had already frozen the offshore routing accounts. And now they were here to collect the physical bodies. Justin scrambled backward, tripping over the edge of the plush carpet and collapsing onto the floor. 2 agents instantly descended upon him. They grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back with a practiced, forceful efficiency. The metallic, heavy click of steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the boardroom. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of a life ending. Chris jumped up from his chair, raising his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender. The slick, arrogant confidence that had defined his entire existence evaporated instantly. He started shouting legal jargon, demanding to call his retained corporate counsel, claiming he was a licensed fiduciary and that this was a massive jurisdictional error. Agent Robert stepped forward and coldly informed Chris that his corporate counsel was currently being detained at his own offices for facilitating international money laundering. The color drained from Chris's face as an agent forcefully shoved him against the mahogany table, securing his wrists in cold steel. Megan did not resist. When the agents approached her chair, she simply went limp. The fight had completely left her body. The realization that the federal government had reached her before the Macau syndicate enforcers actually seemed to bring a sick, twisted wave of relief to her eyes. She offered her wrists to the agents without a single word, staring blankly at the floor as the metal cuffs locked into place. Danielle was the only one who fought. My daughter, stripped of her designer arrogance, thrashed wildly as a female agent gripped her arms. She screamed for me, twisting her neck to look back at where I stood. She begged me to call them off, shrieking that she was my little girl, that this was all a terrible mistake, that I could not let them take her away in front of everyone. I looked directly into her terrified, pleading eyes, and I offered her nothing. Not a shred of pity, not an ounce of hesitation. I simply watched as the agent forcefully pinned her arms and secured the restraints. She had shown zero mercy when she ordered the doctors to stop my heart. I was showing zero mercy as the federal government stopped her life. Agent Robert read the charges aloud, his voice booming over Danielle's hysterical sobbing. He listed conspiracy to commit bank fraud, federal wire fraud, identity theft, the forgery of a medical proxy, and the embezzlement of charitable foundation funds. Every single charge carried a mandatory federal sentence. They were not facing a slap on the wrist or a quiet corporate settlement. They were facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The agents pulled my children and their spouses to their feet. The real punishment, however, was not the cold metal around their wrists. The real punishment was the long, agonizing walk they were about to endure. Warren Gallagher's law firm was located on the 40th floor of the premier commercial high-rise in the financial district. The building was heavily populated by the city's corporate elite rival developers, investment bankers, and the very high society peers my children had desperately tried to impress at my fake memorial service just days prior. The agents marched them out of the boardroom and into the expansive, glass-walled main lobby of the firm. It was the middle of the afternoon. The floor was bustling with paralegals, senior partners, and wealthy clients. The moment the FBI agents emerged, hauling 4 handcuffed individuals, all conversation ceased. Dozens of people stopped dead in their tracks. Justin tried to lower his chin to his chest, desperately attempting to hide his face from the staring eyes. But the agents kept him moving at a brisk, unrelenting pace. Danielle openly wept, her expensive black dress rumpled and disgraced, the mascara running in thick, dark streaks down her face. People she had dined with, people she had lied to, were now pulling out their cell phones, recording the spectacular, unvarnished destruction of her reputation. Chris, the man who had built his entire identity on projecting an aura of untouchable wealth, stared blankly at the marble floor, completely stripped of his armor. He was no longer a vulture capitalist. He was just another common criminal caught in a federal net. Megan dragged her feet, looking like an empty shell, completely humiliated under the harsh fluorescent lights of the corporate elevator bank. I followed the procession at a slow, measured distance. I rode down in the secondary elevator, stepping out into the grand ground floor lobby of the high-rise. This building was the epicenter of the world I had operated in for 40 years. These were my peers, watching my children being paraded out through the revolving glass doors. I stepped out onto the wet pavement of the street. A line of dark federal transport vehicles sat idling at the curb, their red and blue lights flashing silently, reflecting off the slick asphalt. The midday crowd on the sidewalk had stopped to watch the spectacle. I stood under the heavy canvas awning of the building, my hands tucked into the pockets of my tailored suit, watching as the agents forced Justin, Danielle, Chris, and Megan into the back of the armored vans. The heavy metal doors slammed shut one by one, sealing them inside a dark, claustrophobic reality they could never charm, buy, or forge their way out of. I watched the convoy merge into the heavy city traffic, disappearing down the avenue. The toxic infection that had plagued my family had been surgically removed. My legacy was clean. They had tried to push me into the shadows, but I had dragged them into the blinding, unforgiving light of absolute ruin. 6 months passed since the afternoon the federal agents stormed Warren Gallagher's boardroom. 6 months since I watched my children and the parasites they married paraded out of that corporate high-rise in handcuffs. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift, brutal, and completely absolute. The federal government, armed with the pristine, undeniable digital and physical evidence I had provided, dismantled their lives with a ruthless efficiency. The prosecution didn't even need me to testify. The recorded confessions, the forged signatures on the banking documents, and the wire transfers across state lines built an ironclad, suffocating case. Their defense attorneys, funded by court, appointed stipends because every cent they had access to was frozen, attempted to construct a narrative of desperation. They tried to paint me as an absentee father, a cold corporate developer who had neglected their emotional needs, driving them to extreme measures. It was a pathetic, grasping strategy that the federal judge dismissed out of hand. The judge recognized their actions for what they truly were: pure, calculated, premeditated greed. The sentencing hearing took place on a Tuesday morning. I sat in the front row of the federal courthouse wearing a dark, tailored suit. I did not sit in the gallery as a grieving father. I sat there as the architect of their destruction, bearing witness to the final act of this tragedy. The courtroom was packed. My story had bled into the local press, becoming a cautionary tale of family betrayal and the dangers of elder financial abuse. But I didn't care about the cameras or the reporters. I only cared about the 4 people sitting at the defense tables. They looked remarkably diminished. The arrogance, the entitlement, the slick veneer of wealth had been entirely stripped away. They wore identical prison-issued jumpsuits, their wrists cuffed and chained to their waists. Justin looked hollowed out, a man who had finally realized he possessed none of the strength he thought he had inherited. Danielle sat with her shoulders slumped, staring blankly at the polished wooden table, the reality of losing her designer life finally sinking in. Chris, the vulture capitalist, looked terrifyingly ordinary, without his bespoke suits and offshore accounts. Megan simply stared at the floor, perhaps relieved she was facing a federal judge instead of the enforcers from Macau. The judge delivered the sentences with a chilling finality. For conspiracy to commit bank fraud, federal wire fraud, forgery, and the theft of charitable foundation funds, Chris received 15 years in federal prison. Justin for initiating the wire transfers and actively attempting to establish the fraudulent medical proxy received 14 years. Danielle was sentenced to 12 years for her role as the secondary guarantor on the forged loan and her active participation in the conspiracy. Megan received 10 years for the embezzlement of the charity funds and her role in looting my private safe. As the bailiffs moved forward to escort them back to their holding cells, Justin stopped. He turned and looked back at me from across the courtroom. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no defiance. There was only a profound, devastating comprehension. He finally understood the absolute cost of his greed. He understood that he hadn't just lost a massive inheritance. He had lost his father, his freedom, and his entire future. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to offer some final pathetic plea for forgiveness, but the bailiff placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and shoved him forward. I held his gaze until he was dragged through the heavy oak doors, offering him nothing but cold, unyielding silence. I walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the bright, crisp afternoon air. The burden I had carried since waking up in that hospital room, the suffocating weight of my children's betrayal, finally lifted from my shoulders. The empire of deceit they had tried to build on my grave had been burned completely to the ground. But I knew that simply destroying them was not enough to honor Diane's memory. I had to build something better from the ashes. Over the next 3 months, I worked closely with Warren Gallagher. We methodically liquidated my entire commercial real estate portfolio. I sold the 4th Street Plaza to the Chicago investment firm, this time legitimately. I sold the residential complexes, the warehouses, and the undeveloped municipal lots. I converted 40 years of concrete, steel, and ambition into massive liquid capital. But I didn't keep a single cent of it for myself. I took the vast, staggering wealth and channeled it entirely into the Diane Mercer Foundation. I completely restructured the charity. It was no longer just a pediatric cancer fund. I transformed it into a ruthless, heavily armed legal defense organization. I endowed the foundation with $50 million, specifically designated to provide free top-tier corporate attorneys and forensic accountants to elderly victims of family financial abuse. I built an army of legal sharks just like Warren, whose sole purpose was to hunt down greedy relatives, fraudulent caretakers, and anyone who attempted to exploit the vulnerable. Diane had spent her life protecting children. I would spend the rest of mine protecting those who had been betrayed by the children they raised. I sold the sprawling, empty mansion where Justin and Danielle had grown up, where they had plotted my death. I didn't need the space, and I certainly didn't need the ghosts. I purchased a small, modest home on a quiet, tree-lined street near the edge of the city. It was simple, elegant, and entirely peaceful. Tonight, I stand on this back balcony of that small home. The sun is setting, casting a warm golden glow over the manicured lawn. I hold a heavy crystal tumbler filled with single malt bourbon. The house is perfectly quiet. There are no frantic phone calls, no forced family dinners, no entitled heirs waiting for me to die. There is only peace. I take a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the heat settle in my chest. My heart, the very heart that had failed me and given my children the opportunity to strike beats with a steady, strong rhythm. They thought they could push me into the shadows. They thought my love for them would make me a blind, easy target. They underestimated the very man who gave them life. I raise my glass toward the setting sun, offering a silent toast to Diane, knowing I have finally honored her legacy. The war is over. The monsters are locked in cages, and I am a free man standing watch over a fortress built on absolute truth. The most profound lesson from John Mercer's journey is that unconditional love should never require the sacrifice of your own dignity or survival. Blood relations do not automatically grant someone the right to exploit, manipulate, or destroy you for their own financial gain. When we blindly protect our loved ones from the natural consequences of their actions, we risk turning them into entitled predators. True family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and integrity, not just a shared last name or an expected inheritance. Sometimes the most necessary act of tough love is stepping aside and letting the greedy face the absolute unforgiving reality of their own choices. If John's fight for justice resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of ultimate resilience and hard-earned vindication.